What if I told you that America, as you know it today, might never have existed? What if the Confederate States of America won the Civil War and became an independent nation? Imagine waking up in a world where the United States was split in two, where slavery continued for decades longer, where the most powerful country on earth never rose to power. This isn't just an alternate history story. This is a complete reimagining of the modern world. And the consequences? They're more shocking than you could ever imagine. In our reality, the American Civil War ended in 1865 with the Union's victory. President Abraham Lincoln preserved the nation. Slavery was abolished, and over the next century and a half, the United States became the world's dominant superpower, a beacon of democracy, innovation, and military might. But what if history had taken a different turn? What if Confederate General Robert E. Lee's army had won at Gettysburg? What if European powers had recognized the Confederacy and provided military support? What if the North simply gave up after years of bloody stalemate? Today, we're exploring one of the most dramatic alternate histories possible, a world where the South won the Civil War, where two nations emerged from one, and where everything you know about modern America would be fundamentally different. Picture this. Instead of one America stretching from coast to coast, imagine two separate countries sharing the continent. The United States of America in the north, capital, Washington, D.C., and the Confederate States of America in the south, capital, Richmond, Virginia. Two different flags, two different governments, two completely different societies. The Mason-Dixon line is no longer just a historical boundary. It's an international border with checkpoints, customs, and passport controls. The map of North America looks radically different. Instead of 50 states united under one banner, you have two rival nations, each suspicious of the other, each competing for power, resources, and influence. This isn't just a political change. This is a geographic, economic, and cultural earthquake that reshapes the entire world. So how could the South have actually won? Let's be clear. In our timeline, the Confederacy faced enormous challenges. The North had more people, more factories, more railroads, and more resources. But history is full of surprises. Smaller nations have defeated larger powers before. Here are the key scenarios that could have changed everything. First, military victory at crucial battles. If Lee had won decisively at Gettysburg in 1863, the war's momentum could have shifted entirely. A Confederate army marching on Washington, D.C. might have forced Lincoln to negotiate peace. Second, foreign intervention. Britain and France came very close to recognizing the Confederacy. If they had provided military support, weapons, and naval power, the South's chances would have dramatically improved. The Union Navy's blockade would have been broken. Confederate armies would have been better supplied. Third, war exhaustion in the North. The Civil War was incredibly bloody. Over 600,000 Americans died. If the Northern public had grown tired of the endless casualties and demanded peace, Lincoln might have been forced to let the South go. Fourth, Lincoln's assassination earlier in the war. Without Lincoln's leadership and determination to preserve the Union at all costs, a weaker president might have accepted a negotiated separation. Any one of these scenarios, or a combination of them, could have resulted in Confederate independence, and once that happened, the world would never be the same. Let's start with the immediate political aftermath. By 1865 or 1866, a peace treaty is signed. The Confederate States of America is officially recognized as an independent nation. 11 states, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Jefferson Davis remains President of the Confederacy. The Confederate Constitution is fully implemented. And here's where things get complicated. The Confederate government was explicitly built to protect states' rights and the institution of slavery. This isn't speculation. It's written directly into their Constitution. Now you have two Americas. The United States, still led from Washington, controls the North and West. The Confederacy, led from Richmond, controls the Deep South and parts of the border regions. But what about the Western territories? California, Oregon, Nevada. They likely remain with the Union. But states like Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland, those become contested zones. Perhaps they're split, with some counties joining the Confederacy. The border between these two nations becomes heavily militarized. Think of the Cold War's Iron Curtain, but right through the heart of America. Forts, troops, and constant tension. The threat of another war always looming. In Washington, the U.S. government is dominated by Republicans and abolitionists, furious at the South's secession. They view the Confederacy as traitors and refuse normal diplomatic relations for decades. Trade is limited. Movement between the two countries is restricted. In Richmond, the Confederate government faces its own challenges. How do you build a functioning nation from scratch? Creating a currency, a postal system, a professional army, diplomatic relations with other countries, all while maintaining the institution of slavery, which is increasingly condemned by the rest of the world. Now let's talk about the economy. This is where the alternate timeline gets really dark. In our reality, slavery ended in 1865 with the 13th Amendment. But in this timeline, slavery continues in the Confederacy, possibly for decades longer. The Confederate economy remains heavily agricultural. Cotton, tobacco, sugar, and rice. These plantations continued to rely on enslaved labor. And here's the brutal truth. With independence secured, the Confederate government has no incentive to end slavery. In fact, they might even expand it, pushing into Latin America, trying to acquire Cuba or parts of Mexico to create new slave territories. But there's a major problem. By the late 1800s, the rest of the world is turning against slavery. Britain abolished it in 1833, France in 1448. Even Brazil, the last major slaveholding nation in the Americas, abolishes it in 1888. The Confederacy becomes an international pariah, a slave nation in a world that's moved on. European countries refuse to trade with them. International banks won't invest. The Confederate economy stagnates while the North industrializes rapidly. Meanwhile, the United States experiences an economic boom. Without the South's political influence blocking tariffs and industrial policy, the North invests heavily in factories, railroads, and infrastructure. Immigration from Europe continues. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia explode in size. By 1900, the economic gap is enormous. The United States is becoming an industrial giant. The Confederacy is an agricultural backwater, isolated and poor. The Confederate dollar is weak, inflation is high, and the white Southern elite, clinging desperately to their plantation system, refuses to modernize. But here's the question that haunts this timeline. How long can slavery actually last? Even in the Confederacy, pressure is building. Enslaved people continue to resist, rebel, and escape to the North. Abolitionist movements within the South grow stronger. And eventually, whether through internal revolution or external pressure, slavery must end. But when? The 1880s? 1900s? 1920s? Every extra decade means millions more people born into bondage. Let's bring this down to the human level. What would daily life actually look like in this divided America? If you're a white person living in the Confederate States, your life depends heavily on your social class. The wealthy plantation owners remain in power, controlling politics and the economy. You might believe in the lost cause mythology even more strongly, celebrating Confederate heroes and defending slavery as a positive good.
But if you're poor or working class, life is hard. The Confederate economy offers few opportunities. No industrial jobs, limited education, and the plantation elite hoards wealth and power. If you're black and living in the Confederacy, your life is a nightmare. Slavery continues. Families are torn apart. Brutal working conditions. No rights whatsoever. And even if slavery eventually ends, you'd face Jim Crow-style segregation for generations. The Confederacy would likely implement even harsher racial laws than existed in our timeline's South. If you're black and living in the United States, life is better, but far from equal. The North still has racism and discrimination, but you're free. You can own property, get an education, and build a life. Many African Americans who escaped from the Confederacy settle in northern cities, creating vibrant communities. Now imagine the cultural divide. Two separate nations developing different identities. In the United States, you have a culture celebrating Union victory, industrial progress, and eventual integration. In the Confederacy, you have a culture built on white supremacy, agricultural tradition, and resentment toward the North. Entertainment, music, literature, all develop differently. Jazz might never emerge the same way without the great migration of black Americans from South to North. Country music might dominate Confederate culture even more strongly. The two nations view each other with suspicion and hostility. And what about families divided by the border? Imagine having relatives on the other side, wanting to visit but needing a passport and visa, maybe not being allowed to cross at all. This isn't ancient history. This is people's grandparents separated by politics and hatred. Now, let's zoom out to the global stage, because a divided America changes everything about the 20th century. First, consider westward expansion. In our timeline, the United States stretched from Atlantic to Pacific, a continental power. But with the Confederacy taking the Deep South, Western expansion becomes more complicated. Does Texas stay Confederate? If so, the Confederacy gains enormous land and resources. If not, it might become independent or even join Mexico. The Spanish-American War in 1898 might not happen or happens differently. Without a united America, Spain might keep Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. American imperialism is weaker. Now the big one, World War I. In our timeline, American entry in 1917 helped tip the balance toward Allied victory. But in this alternate timeline, would the United States even join the war? And would the Confederacy? Possibly both nations stay neutral. A divided, weaker America is less able to project power globally. Without American intervention, World War I might end in a stalemate where Central Powers' victory. The Treaty of Versailles never happens. The entire 20th century looks completely different. Or maybe the United States joins the Allies, while the Confederacy stays neutral or even sides with the Central Powers, seeing an opportunity to weaken their northern rival. Imagine Confederate soldiers fighting alongside Germans against American troops in Europe. The hatred between the two American nations would become permanent. And then World War II. This is where it gets really scary. In our timeline, the United States was the arsenal of democracy, supplying the Allies and eventually defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. But in this timeline, a weaker, divided America can't play that role. If the United States is still bogged down in rivalry with the Confederacy, they might not have the resources or political will to fight overseas. Nazi Germany might win in Europe. Imperial Japan might dominate Asia. The Holocaust continues unchecked. The world falls into darkness. Or consider this terrifying possibility. The Confederate States, a white supremacist slave nation, might actually sympathize with Nazi racial ideology. Could the Confederacy ally with Hitler? It's a horrifying thought, but not impossible. The Nazis admired the American South's racial laws and used them as inspiration. Let's fast forward to today, 2025. What does this alternate world look like now? The United States of America still exists, but it's much weaker than in our timeline. Without the South's territory, resources, and population, it never becomes a superpower. It's a prosperous industrial nation, yes, but not the global hegemon we know. The Confederate States of America? This depends on how their history unfolded. Best case scenario, slavery ended sometime in the early 20th century through internal reform or revolution. The Confederacy slowly modernized, industrialized, and joined a democratic world. By 2025, it's a normal country, still separate from the United States, but peaceful neighbors. Worst case scenario? The Confederacy remained a backwards, authoritarian state for much longer. Slavery persisted into the 1930s or 40s. When it finally ended, brutal apartheid-style segregation replaced it. The Confederacy became an international pariah, sanctioned and isolated. Only in recent decades has it begun to reform. The border between the two nations is still there. Perhaps it's more open now, similar to the U.S.-Canada border, or perhaps tensions remain and crossing requires extensive documentation. Culturally, the two nations are completely different. The United States is progressive, diverse, and forward-looking. The Confederate States, even if reformed, still carries the legacy of slavery and segregation. Monuments to Confederate leaders remain everywhere. The old plantation elite's descendants still hold power. Technology and innovation? Most of it happens in the United States, or perhaps in Europe and Asia if America never dominated globally. Silicon Valley might exist, but it's not the world center of tech. Politics? Imagine two separate governments, two separate militaries, two separate economies, competing and cooperating across a continental border. Sometimes allies, often rivals, always suspicious. And race relations? In the United States, progress has been made, though racism still exists. In the Confederate States, even in the best-case scenario, racial inequality is far worse. The legacy of slavery and segregation runs deeper and longer. Take a moment and think about this. What if you lived in this world? If you're in the North, you might feel grateful to be in the United States rather than the Confederacy, but you'd also live with the knowledge that millions of people across the border suffered under slavery and oppression for generations longer than necessary. If you're in the South and you're white, you might have been raised with completely different values, taught that the Confederacy was right, that secession was justified, that slavery wasn't as bad as Northern propaganda claimed. If you're in the South and you're black, you or your grandparents might have been enslaved. Your family history would be even more painful than it already is in our timeline. Would you try to escape to the North? Would you fight for change in the South? Would you accept the system or resist it? History shapes us in ways we don't always realize. The fact that the United States won the Civil War, that slavery ended in 1865, that the nation remained united, all of these things created the world you live in today. In this alternate timeline, everything would be different. Your country, your culture, your values, possibly even whether you exist at all. Because different historical events mean different people meet, marry, and have children. It's a sobering thought. The course of history hangs on decisions made by individuals, battles won or lost by chance, leadership, courage, and sometimes just luck. So now I want to hear from you. If the South had won the Civil War, which of these outcomes do you think is most realistic? Would slavery have ended peacefully, or would it have required another war? Could the two American nations have eventually reunited, or would they remain separate forever? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's discuss this alternate history together. And if you disagree with any of my analysis, tell me why. I love hearing different perspectives. Also, here's a question. Would you rather live in the United States or the Confederate States in this timeline? And why? Think about it carefully. Your answer reveals a lot about your values and what you think matters in a society. History is full of turning points, moments where everything could have gone differently. The Confederate victory in the Civil War is one of the most dramatic what-ifs in American history. And as we've seen today, the consequences would have been catastrophic, not just for America, but for the entire world. A weaker, divided America, slavery continuing for decades longer, world wars fought differently or maybe won by the wrong side, technology, culture, and human rights all delayed or destroyed. It's a dark timeline, and it makes you appreciate what actually happened. The Union's victory wasn't inevitable. It was hard-fought, costly, and close. And the world we live in today exists because of the courage and sacrifice of those who fought to preserve the United States. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into alternate history, make sure to subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Next time, we're exploring an even crazier scenario. What if America never gained independence from Britain? Trust me, you don't want to miss it. See you in the next video, and remember, history is never set in stone. Every choice matters. Every action has consequences. And sometimes the world we know hangs by a thread.